Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Inka Vat. Pressure is mounting in the South China Sea. At Scarborough Shoal, the Philippines says the Chinese Coast Guard fired water cannon at two government fishery vessels resupplying fishermen, though the cannon didn't reach them. And at First Thomas Shoal, a Chinese missile ship directed a military-grade laser 3 times toward a Philippines fishery plane. In the Paracels, China has rejected Vietnam's account of an attack on 10 fishermen, 3 of whom suffered broken bones. So, where is all this leading? Joining us to discuss this are Chen Ping-kuei, National Chengchi University Department of Diplomacy Professor, and Marcin Jerzewski, European Values Centre for Security Policy Taiwan Office Head. A very warm welcome to both of you on the show today. Before we get into China's actions, let's start with the Philippines' Sama-Sama drills, which means togetherness, and the visit of South Korea's president to Manila. This year's Sama-Sama drills take place off Luzon, close to Taiwan, involving Australia, Canada, France, Japan, the US and the Philippines. 1,000 personnel participate in high-intensity exercises focusing on anti-submarine, anti-surface and anti-air warfare. And as they got underway, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and Ferdinand Marcos Jr. signed a strategic partnership in Manila. This is what Yoon had to say.
양국은 안보 분야에서 전략적 협력을 강화해 나가기로 했습니다. 우리 두 정상은 방산 협력을 강화하기로 했으며 특히 필리핀의 군 현대화 3단계 사업에 한국이 적극 참여해 나가기로 했습니다.
The development builds on comments made by South Korea's ambassador to the Philippines in September of raising their partnership in maritime security to a higher level, as both countries mark 75 years of diplomatic relations this year. Professor Chen, I'd like to start with you. So the Philippines, as we can see, is gathering more and more global support. Does the South Korean strategic partnership mean that we can see more involvement from South Korea, for example, in Sama-Sama drills?
I think it is true that we can see South Korea will take part and play a role in Philippines' security matters, especially based on what we have known recently. South Korea is willing to support in terms of defense industry, in terms of maritime security surveillance, and maybe training. So, but military drill together with Philippines might take a little bit more time to fulfill. The trip of the South Korean president this time focused mainly on economic cooperation. There are a lot of economic assistance in infrastructure building projects. So security agreement, of course, is another important thing, but not the major thing during his visit.
And what do you think about Coast Guard cooperation? Do you think that there could be joint South Korean and Philippine Coast Guard patrols?
I do think that this is what the Philippines want. I think South Korea will consider this seriously. There is a possibility that South Koreans will send its Coast Guard vessels to the vicinity of the Philippine Sea. And we have to wait and see. I cannot make a right assessment right now.
Marcin, so what does the support of South Korea, which is another middle power in the region, also a US treaty ally, of course, what does that mean to the Philippines in terms of the bigger picture of protecting its sovereignty against China?
At the end of the day, money matters, and it is important that we don't overlook the commercial dimension of closer security and defense ties between South Korea and the Philippines. One of the core tenets of President Yoon's economic development strategy was to boost South Korea's role as an important exporter of arms and defense equipment. By 2027, Korea is slated to become the 4th largest exporter of defense articles globally. And at the same time, there is clear synergy with the Philippines. The country decided to spend over $35 billion over the next decade to modernize its army and other branches of the military amid threats from China. So at the end of the day, this commercial dimension is of great importance.
Yeah, so there is the supply and the demand in this relationship. Professor Chen, a Chinese missile ship chased a Philippines fisheries vessel. It was meant to be resupplying fishermen near or at Half Moon Bay. The same Chinese Navy ship then directed its military-grade laser up at a fisheries plane in the sky 3 times. How dangerous is such a move?
So these weapons, these laser pointers, will temporarily blind the pilots of an aircraft. So it is dangerous, and aircraft pilots will try to avoid them. So this is why many countries condemn this kind of action, because it can crash the airplane. Even though it will not cause permanent blindness of the pilot, a temporary blindness will be very dangerous during the flight.
It could still be fatal.
Yeah.
And so there's a difference, isn't there, between this incident and the earlier incident where they used this against a vessel, I believe it was a Philippine Coast Guard. Do you see that as an escalation then?
Well, I think this has become a routine that the Chinese Coast Guard is doing in South China Sea. Unfortunately, this has a certain degree of danger in it, because as you temporarily blind the vessel or a flight, it can cause the vessel or flight to crash. So it is a dangerous move. But I wouldn't say China escalate the situation. China just try to use this for a very long time.
Right. Marcin, how about the Chinese Navy vessel? It was a missile ship, chasing a Philippine government or civilian vessel. The optics of this is not very good.
The optics are not very good, but these activities is something that we should be expecting from the People's Liberation Army, because all these activities, whether we're talking about the use of high-grade lasers or Chinese Navy vessels chasing civilian vessels from the Philippines, all of these activities can be summarized as a PLA's psychological warfare. And already in 2003, the PLA has lined out very explicitly its 3-pronged strategy of political warfare, consisting of legal warfare, public opinion warfare, and importantly, psychological warfare. So all these activities can be summarized as an effort to influence the psyche of the opponent, in this case of Filipino stakeholders, and threaten them or psychologically coerce them into yielding to China's demands.
Yeah, so all part of the grey zone tactics and campaign that essentially have seen China take control of a large part of the South China Sea?
Absolutely, and I fully agree with Professor Chen that these activities do not necessarily constitute a major escalation, but rather are a manifestation of cementation of use of these intimidation grey zone tactics in the region. But we can zoom out even more, because China is using very similar tactics in other parts of the Indo-Pacific theater. Already in 2018, a Chinese base in Djibouti has used high-level military-grade lasers to blind in a very similar way pilots of American aircraft. So it is, not to belay the point, but it is hardly a new tool in China's toolbox of intimidation across the Indo-Pacific region.
Okay, so you see it as more of the same, essentially.
Absolutely.
Right. Now, in the Paracel Islands, Vietnam has condemned China after 10 fishermen were assaulted by Chinese law enforcement officers on September 29th. According to local media, Tien Phong, the men were beaten with a meter-long rod, possibly made of iron, which resulted in 3 fishers with broken arms. The Paracels, which partially lie between or within both Hanoi's and Beijing's EEZ, were seized by China following a bloody battle in 1974 in which more than 100 Vietnamese and 18 Chinese soldiers were killed. Tien Phong reported the officers seized about 4 tons of seafood and smashed and removed equipment from the boat. Losses were estimated at $20,000. US dollars. Vietnam's foreign ministry said in an email statement to Bloomberg, Vietnam is extremely concerned, indignant and resolutely opposes the brutal behavior of Chinese law enforcement forces against Vietnamese fishermen and fishing vessels operating in the Paracel archipelago of Vietnam. It said they protested the incident with China's Hanoi embassy and demanded, quote, China to fully respect Vietnam's sovereignty over the Paracel archipelago and do not repeat similar actions. So, Professor Chen, let me come to you. How rare was that, show of outrage by Vietnam? Very public outrage.
In terms of the government, it is not uncommon. The Vietnamese government usually will issue this kind of comments to ask for restraint. But for public It is getting more and more frequent. Every other year, we have seen public protests against China over maybe South China Sea dispute or over...
So you didn't think that Hanoi's language was stronger this time?
No, I wouldn't say it is stronger, but it is strong. It is strong, and it shows the dissatisfaction of Vietnamese government over China's behavior in South China Sea.
Do you agree with Professor Chen that the language wasn't that much stronger than usual?
I believe that we did see an escalation on the rhetorical level, and today we're talking about both Vietnam and the Philippines, and conceptually we often juxtapose the approach taken by Manila and Hanoi to confrontations in the South China Sea. The Philippines has embarked on a strategy of so-called assertive transparency, contrasted with Vietnam's assertive opacity. And I believe that that explicit statement, that is a very harsh condemnation of Chinese activity, manifests at least a singular departure from this overall approach of assertive opacity.
So that's interesting. So do you think that is a sign for you that perhaps Hanoi will no longer remain silent in the face of these actions?
Recently, we have also learned that Vietnam has hardly remained idle in the face of Chinese escalation in the South China Sea, also vis-à-vis Vietnam with its own territorial claims and interests in the region. So there have been multiple reports of Vietnam's efforts to frantically follow China in an effort to also construct artificial islands, potentially with an intention to militarize them in the future, which perhaps means that this rhetorical escalation that we're talking about just sheds a little bit more of a light on the responses that Vietnam has already been preparing behind closed door.
Right, right. Professor Chen, Philippine Coast Guard spokesperson Jay Tariella says that Manila's neighbours' silence, condones China's behaviour, it emboldens even further. It emboldens China's illegal acts. In a recent meeting in Jakarta, Indonesian President-elect Subianto Prabowo told Vietnamese leader To Lam that he wanted to cooperate in terms of, the challenges that both of them face in the South China Sea. Do you see that there's any movement towards what the Philippines wants of ASEAN, which is to have this more coordinated, collective movement?
I do agree that Vietnam has been changing for over the last couple of months. I think this is because there are chances for Vietnam to cooperate with other countries. But we know that for experience in the past, Vietnam doesn't really try to cooperate or coordinate with other countries.
In fact, it's got a policy not to do that.
Yes. Yeah. But more recently, we see more moves to coordinate maritime security issues and Coast Guard cooperations with other countries, even outer region countries. I do think that shows a sign of change of policy from Vietnam government.
Right. Marcin, Vietnam said that China seriously violated its sovereignty over the Paracels. So, what is the cost of doing that to China?
Unfortunately, I believe that at this point the cost remains quite low, and that's why China is emboldened to continuously manifest its regional hegemonic ambitions vis-à-vis partners across Southeast Asia, across ASEAN. And we actually see very similar patterns of Chinese behavior vis-à-vis two regional groupings, the European Union that I look at on a daily basis and ASEAN. So despite its pronouncements that China wants to see more multilateralism and multilateral frameworks within the international system, it often ignores unity that countries try to build through these multilateral formats and tries to push their agenda bilaterally. But because many of these bilateral relations are inherently asymmetrical, it is more difficult for Vietnam or the Philippines to negotiate with China individually. So unless we see more of a consensus across the ASEAN 10 in terms of addressing the situation in the South China Sea, Beijing will benefit from its advantage of size and power projection capability.
Right. And we should also say that, the reason why perhaps countries will listen to Beijing and will keep on operating at the bilateral level is because they feel that their economy might suffer if they do stand up against China, Professor?
I also think that in addition to the economic exchange, which Vietnam and Philippines both have a lot of economic relations with Beijing, but also countries like Vietnam would consider restraint as a tactic to restrain China's aggressive behavior. But I think more recently, the Vietnamese government realized that it is not working, and Vietnam might have to introduce more countries to coordinate with more countries to restrain China in South China Sea. So that's why we see the move.
Okay. Now, according to Vietnam, China also violated an agreement by the two leaders to better manage their territorial disputes. In Vietnamese President To Lam's first trip abroad in August, he visited Xi Jinping to reset bilateral relations. Xi told Lam that the two sides had built ties of, quote, strategic significance over the past decade. And he said, "I am willing to establish good working relations and a personal friendship with you and jointly lead the creation of a China-Vietnam community of a shared future with deeper and solid progress." Marcin, so where does this latest incident, where does it leave ties between the two countries?
Let me start by emphasizing that the recent meeting of the two leaders of Vietnam and China is not ushering a new era in bilateral relations between Hanoi and Beijing. Vietnam has for a long time pursued an omnidirectional strategy in its diplomacy that is centered around two keywords, resiliency and adaptability. So this bamboo diplomacy, as Vietnamese diplomats would call it, allows Vietnam to go back and forth between China and also Western partners in ASEAN, and so on. So the relationship with Beijing for Hanoi also goes back and forth, and the ultimate objective for Hanoi is to achieve a sense of strategic autonomy. If in the eyes of Hanoi, Beijing crossed a red line, we see this rhetorical change, more assertive pronouncement, but I don't think that it will usher in a significant change in the relationship over a long term.
Okay, and do you think that that is precisely because China calculates that Vietnam needs China more than the other way around?
I'm sure that this is a part of Beijing's calculus in its approach vis-à-vis Hanoi. Something to bear in mind is that different dimensions of the relationship between Vietnam and China are quite highly compartmentalized. Of course, Vietnam views China as a security concern, and we see it manifest itself in the South China Sea or in the case of the most recent incident. But political and economic relations remain quite close. Vietnam can also benefit from the global move to de-risk or diversify away from China, and the business sector in China hasn't remained indifferent to that. For example, there's now a big push to move some of the solar panel manufacturing by Chinese companies to Vietnam. It's just one of many examples of how the economic aspect of that relationship can be effectively dehyphenated from the security concerns by Hanoi.
Okay. Let's move now, Professor Chen, to the defense cooperation agreement that was signed between the Philippines and Vietnam in August. Now, this was seen as an important step to essentially protecting both countries' sovereignty against the threats from China in the South China Sea. Do you see that China's recent actions, we've got the Vietnamese fishermen who were attacked, and then the Philippines ongoing, really, but the laser to the aircraft, which is a dangerous maneuver. Do you see that as sort of coordinated and in reaction to their partnership?
I think China is indeed trying to test the cooperation or coordination between Vietnam and the Philippines to see whether their defense cooperation will bring them together and consult with each other or build a common front against China. I think China is still, and I think China is targeted at the Philippines because it has more disputes with the Philippines, and it is the Philippines who really wants the foreign help, foreign assistance to the dispute islands. So China put more pressure on the Philippine side, and see whether Vietnam is willing to break its original position and try to get involved in somebody else's business.
But why would they do that?
I think China always, like Marcin just said, China always try to prevent a common front against China, right? So China is trying to see whether its pressure can really unite those foreign countries together, or they're just bluffing.
Right.
Yeah.
So its end goal, obviously, is not to form that front, but could we say that actually its efforts are backfiring in that it is pushing Vietnam closer to the Philippines?
I do think China's doing is backfiring, but at the same time, I think China will try to step back if it finds that its actions start to bring these two countries or even more countries together and create a common front against China.
So, Marcin, if we were China and we're looking at this, would it seem indeed that many countries are actually coalescing together in support of the Philippines?
If I were sitting in Beijing right now, I would still remain cautiously optimistic, because I believe that whenever we analyze events such as the signing of the security pact between Hanoi and Manila, there is an inherent tension between two S words, symbolism and substance. And I believe that this new deal between the Philippines and Vietnam is richer in symbolism than in substance. And what I mean by that is, during the visit of the Vietnamese Minister of Defense to Manila, during which he paid a visit to the presidential office and spoke to Marcos Jr., he didn't mention China at all when discussing common threats that brought the Philippines and Vietnam together. And we should bear in mind that the Vietnamese Minister of Defense would have every reason to do that as a veteran of the Sino-Vietnamese War in the late 70s. Instead, the emphasis on cooperation, particularly between the navies of two countries, was on joint disaster response. And the minister also emphasized the Vietnamese policy of 4 no's, which includes no instrumentalization of cooperation with Vietnam to position one country against the other, and also no threat of use of force in international relations. And it is precisely due to this mild language that I believe that this is more of a symbolic move than a new partnership that could substantially counter China's threats in the South China Sea.
But not mentioning China is also something that's commonly used, isn't it? It doesn't mean that China is not behind the threats or the background that have created that partnership.
Of course, we could also understand it in light of this approach of assertive opacity that Vietnam has used. So once again, we could pay attention to what is unsaid rather than what is said. At the end of the day, I still think that due to its history of defense non-alignment, Vietnam will be very cautious before taking any more assertive steps in conjunction with any of the regional partners vis-à-vis China.
So it would have to be, Professor Chen, pushed very hard before any such move. Do you think that China is also having to calculate what the US might do?
Well, I think China is counting on that the US will stand out of it, because so far China tried to coerce on what? Fishermen, right, on fishing boats, right? We haven't seen that Chinese Coast Guard have a direct confrontation or collision with naval vessels.
There was just the one naval vessel which was attacked with knives and axes. That was a rigid hull.
Yeah, that was very serious.
Right.
So China is counting on that the U.S. will not be directly involved in those incidents because those are considered not military moves. And if you have a dispute over doing the patrol, usually it's not in the U.S. interest to get involved.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so what you're saying is that we're very far off from any sort of trigger to get the US involved or any red lines being crossed. Marcin, final question. So in the joint military exercises, which were before the summer ones, this is between the Philippines, US, Japan, and Australia, New Zealand participated for the first time. How significant was that?
It is definitely significant from the perspective of New Zealand's greater integration in the inter-theater perspective on challenging common threats. So In Europe, we pay a lot of attention to New Zealand's engagement in these multilateral formats, as New Zealand is one of the 4 countries in the Indo-Pacific region that has an individual tailored partnership program with NATO. And therefore, the participation in those frameworks is really important from the perspective of information sharing and also burden sharing.
Yeah, it's also one of the 5 Eyes, obviously.
Absolutely. So it's precisely because of New Zealand's participation in these frameworks that their enhanced presence at those sorts of joint exercises is an important step. Previously, governments in New Zealand have been extremely cautious not to create tensions with China. I believe that the economic dimension played an important part. As a major agricultural producer, New Zealand relies heavily on access to the Chinese market, and we have seen very clearly that China does not hesitate to instrumentalize trade in agricultural and food products as a tool of its economic statecraft, as a response to, for example, deployment of more traditional tools of statecraft, such as manifestation of military might.
Okay, so Professor Chen, very finally and very briefly, because we're over time, what does that mean then, that New Zealand is getting involved?
I think New Zealand is fulfilling its policy into action. It has been a while since New Zealand started to be aware of China's threat in the South Pacific, and now New Zealand is more and more willing to send military capabilities to the South Pacific and the South China Sea to get involved.
Okay, Chen Ping-kuei and Marcin Jerzewski, thank you so much for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.